The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of snow and desperation. Emma Evans stood at the edge of the precipice, her calloused hands gripping the rope that held Thomas Williams, suspended over the churning waters below. The storm had come without warning, turning their careful descent into a nightmare of loose rock and treacherous footing. Now, with darkness closing in and the temperature dropping fast, everything hung in the balance. "Let me go, Emma," Thomas called up through the driving sleet, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The rope won't hold us both." Emma's hands, scarred and weathered from years of hard labor, tightened their grip. These hands had known poverty, had begged for work, had been refused countless times because they bore the marks of desperation. But now, in this moment, they were all that stood between life and death. "I've got you," she shouted back, her voice cracking with emotion and strain. "I won't let go." Below her, Thomas looked up through the storm, seeing not the broken woman who had stumbled onto his property 3 months ago, begging for work, but the fierce, determined soul who had captured his heart without either of them realizing it was happening. Her hands, those hands that had told the story of her struggles the moment he first saw them, now held his very life. But how had they come to this moment, suspended between earth and sky, their fates intertwined like the rope that connected them? The story began on a different kind of precipice entirely, one measured not in feet, but in the depths of human desperation. 3 months earlier, the autumn sun had painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and crimson, but Emma Evans saw none of its beauty. She stumbled along the mountain trail, her worn boots barely holding together, her stomach hollow with hunger that had become her constant companion. The dress she wore, once her finest, now hung in tatters, patched and repatched until more thread than original fabric held it together. Her hands shook as she paused to rest against a boulder, not from the mountain cold but from weakness. When had she last eaten a full meal? 2 days? 3? Time had become fluid when survival was measured in single breaths, and the next step forward. The sound of an axe biting into wood echoed through the valley below, rhythmic and strong. Where there was work being done, there might be someone willing to pay for help, or at least spare a crust of bread. Emma forced herself upright and began the careful descent toward the sound. Thomas Williams paused in his wood splitting, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the cool mountain air. Something had caught his attention, a movement among the aspens that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. He set down his axe and watched as a figure emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy. At first glance, he might have mistaken the approaching person for a scarecrow, all angles and patches. But as the figure drew closer, he could see it was a woman, young despite the weariness that seemed to weigh down every step. Her dark hair hung lank around a face that might have been pretty if not for the hollow cheeks and the desperate gleam in her eyes. She stopped at the edge of his property, as if an invisible fence held her back. Thomas had seen that look before, in the eyes of wild animals that approached human habitation when winter pressed too hard. It was the look of someone who had exhausted every other option. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carefully neutral. In these mountains, desperation could make people dangerous. But something about this woman's posture suggested she was more likely to flee than fight. Emma's head snapped up at his voice, and for a moment Thomas saw her calculate the distance back to the trees, the energy it would cost to run. But then her shoulders sagged in defeat, and she took a tentative step forward. "I don't mean to trespass, sir," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse and thirst. "I was wondering if you might have work. I'll work for supper, nothing more." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd practiced them, but feared she wouldn't have the courage to speak them when the moment came. Thomas found himself studying her more closely, taking in the careful way she held herself, the pride that hadn't quite been beaten down by whatever circumstances had brought her to his door. "What kind of work can you do?" he asked, not unkindly. Emma lifted her hands, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest at the sight of them. They were a woman's hands, but they told a story of hardship that made his own calloused palm seem soft by comparison. Scars crisscrossed the knuckles, some old and white, others still pink with recent healing. The nails were broken and dirty, the skin cracked and rough from work and weather. But it wasn't the damage that caught his attention. It was the way she held them, with a strange mixture of shame and defiance, as if she expected judgment but was prepared to meet it head-on. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can tend animals, work a garden, split kindling. I'm not afraid of hard work, sir. These hands have done whatever needed doing." Thomas nodded slowly, still studying those hands. They were honest hands, he realized. Hands that had known real work, real struggle. In a territory where a person's worth was often measured by what they could contribute, these hands spoke of someone who had never given up, no matter how hard life had pressed. "Name's Thomas Williams," he said finally. "And you are?" "Emma Evans," she replied, and he caught the slight hesitation, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to claim even her own name. "Well, Miss Evans, I reckon I could use some help around here. Can't pay much more than meals and a place to sleep, but it's honest work." The transformation in her face was immediate and profound. The desperate gleam in her eyes softened to something like hope, and for the first time since she'd appeared at the edge of his property, she stood fully upright. "Thank you," she whispered, and Thomas heard in those two words a depth of gratitude that made his chest tight. He showed her to the small cabin that served as his guest quarters, a simple structure he'd built for the occasional trapper or traveler who needed shelter. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof, but it was clean and dry, with a small fireplace for warmth. Emma stood in the doorway, taking in what was probably the first real shelter she'd had in weeks or months. Her hands traced the rough wood of the doorframe with something approaching reverence. "There's a pump out back for washing," Thomas said. "Supper's in an hour. Nothing fancy, just stew and biscuits." She nodded, still seeming unable to quite believe her good fortune. As Thomas turned to leave, she called out softly, "Mr. Williams, why are you helping me?" He paused, considering the question. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Something about her had struck him, the way she'd offered those damaged hands as proof of her willingness to work, the pride that persisted despite her obvious desperation. "Seems like the right thing to do," he said finally, and left her to settle in. That first evening, Emma approached Thomas's main cabin with the careful steps of someone who had learned not to take anything for granted. She'd washed as best she could at the pump, scrubbing away weeks of trail dust and grime, and had attempted to make herself presentable. But there was only so much she could do with the limited resources at hand. Thomas opened the door at her soft knock, and she was struck by how different he looked in the lamplight. Outside, splitting wood, he'd seemed like any other mountain man, all beard and flannel and practical strength. But here, in the warm glow of his home, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes. The careful way he moved that spoke of education as well as experience. The cabin itself was a revelation. She'd expected the typical bachelor's quarters, sparse and utilitarian. Instead, she found herself in a space that was both comfortable and cultured. Books lined shelves built into the walls, their leather spines catching the firelight. A chess set sat on a small table near the window, the pieces carved from what looked like local wood. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean and orderly. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Thomas said, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "Hope you don't mind simple fare." Emma took the offered bowl with hands that trembled slightly, whether from hunger or emotion she couldn't say. The smell that rose from the stew was better than any perfume, rich with meat and vegetables and herbs that made her mouth water. She forced herself to eat slowly, despite every instinct screaming at her to devour the food as quickly as possible. Years of intermittent hunger had taught her that eating too fast after prolonged deprivation would only make her sick. Thomas ate his own meal in companionable silence, occasionally glancing at his guest but not staring. Emma was grateful for his discretion. She was aware of how she must look, how desperate her hunger must be apparent in every careful spoonful. "This is wonderful," she said after a few minutes, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't remember the last time I had a proper meal." "How long have you been on the trail?" Thomas asked gently. Emma paused, calculating. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Time gets away from you when you're walking. "Walking from where?" She hesitated, and Thomas saw the walls go up behind her eyes. "East," she said finally. just east. He nodded, recognizing that some stories weren't ready to be told. Well, you're here now. That's what matters. After supper, Emma insisted on washing the dishes, despite Thomas's protests that she was his guest, not his hired help. But she needed to do something with her hands, needed to contribute in some small way to balance the scales of what she'd received. As she worked at the basin, Thomas found himself watching those hands again. In the lamplight, the scars were more visible, telling stories he could only guess at. There was an old burn across the back of her left hand, long healed but still visible. Several of her fingernails bore the permanent ridges that came from severe malnutrition. But despite the damage, her movements were graceful, efficient. These were hands that had learned to make the most of every motion, to waste nothing. "You're staring," Emma said quietly, not turning around. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Sorry, didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She turned then, drying her hands on the towel he'd provided. "Most people stare. Usually not for long, though. These hands tell stories most folks don't want to hear." "What stories do they tell?" he asked, surprising himself with his boldness. Emma looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers as if seeing them for the first time. "Stories of working in factories where the machines don't care about flesh and bone. Stories of digging in frozen ground for roots to eat. Stories of washing clothes in lye so strong it burns through skin." She looked up at him, her eyes challenging. "Stories of doing whatever it takes to survive." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of strength that had nothing to do with physical power. "They tell stories of someone who doesn't give up," he said quietly. Emma blinked, clearly not having expected that response. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and he saw the vulnerability underneath. "I should let you rest," Thomas said, sensing that she needed time to process the day's events. "We can talk about work arrangements tomorrow." She nodded but lingered in the doorway. "Mr. Williams, thank you. For the meal, for the shelter, for not looking at me like I'm something to be pitied or feared." After she left, Thomas sat by his fire for a long time, thinking about hands and stories and the way desperation could drive people to his remote corner of the world. He'd come here himself to escape, though his circumstances had been far different from Emma's. He'd had choices, options, the luxury of solitude by design rather than necessity. But something about the woman sleeping in his guest cabin had stirred feelings he'd thought long buried. Not pity exactly, though he certainly felt compassion for whatever had brought her so low. It was more a recognition of kinship, of someone who understood that sometimes the only way forward was to keep moving, one step at a time. The next morning, Emma was up before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of uncertainty. She'd learned that the early hours were often the safest, when the world was quiet and she could move without drawing attention. She made her way to the main cabin, intending to start breakfast as a small repayment for Thomas's kindness. She found him already up, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the eastern peaks in shades of rose and gold. He looked up as she approached, and she was struck again by the intelligence in his eyes, the way he seemed to see more than most people. "Morning," he said, raising his cup in greeting. "You're an early riser." "Old habits," Emma replied. "I thought I might start breakfast, if that's all right." Thomas studied her for a moment, taking in the way she held herself, ready to work despite having just arrived. "Emma," he said gently, "you don't owe me anything. Yesterday's meal was freely given." "I know," she said, lifting her chin slightly, "but I need to earn my keep. I won't take charity." There was steel in her voice, a pride that had somehow survived whatever trials had brought her here. Thomas recognized it because he'd felt it himself, the need to maintain dignity even when circumstances stripped away almost everything else. "All right," he said, standing. "Let's talk about what needs doing around here." He led her around the property, pointing out the various tasks that kept a mountain homestead running. There was firewood to be split and stacked, a garden that needed harvesting before the first hard frost, clothes that needed mending, and a dozen other jobs that accumulated when a man lived alone. Emma listened intently, asking practical questions about his preferences and routines. Thomas found himself impressed by her quick understanding, the way she assessed each task with an experienced eye. "The chickens need tending twice a day." he was saying as they approached the small coop he'd built behind the cabin. They're good layers, but they need protection from predators. Emma stepped into the coop and immediately began examining the birds with practiced hands, checking for signs of illness or injury. The chickens, which usually squawked and scattered when Thomas approached, seemed to calm under her touch. "This one's got mites," she said, indicating a hen that had been looking poorly. "And that one there is egg-bound. Nothing serious, but they need attention." Thomas watched as she gently handled the birds, her scarred hands moving with surprising tenderness. "You know chickens?" "I know animals," Emma said simply. "When you're hungry enough, you learn to take care of anything that might feed you." There was no self-pity in the statement, just practical acknowledgement of necessity. Thomas found himself wondering again about her story, about what had taught her such hard-won wisdom. They spent the morning working together, Thomas showing Emma the routines and rhythms of his life. She was a quick learner, adapting to his methods while occasionally suggesting improvements born of her own experience. "You've done this before," he observed as she efficiently organized his tool shed, creating a system that made everything more accessible. "I've done a lot of things," Emma replied. "You learn to be useful wherever you are." By midday, they'd established a comfortable working rhythm. Emma had taken over the cooking, producing a meal that was simple but far better than Thomas's usual bachelor fare. She'd found herbs growing wild near the cabin and had somehow transformed basic ingredients into something approaching elegant. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Thomas asked as they ate. Emma hesitated, that familiar wariness creeping back into her expression. "My mother," she said finally, "before things went wrong." Thomas waited, sensing there was more to the story, but Emma had retreated behind her walls again. He was beginning to recognize the signs, the way she would share small pieces of information, but never the whole picture. That afternoon, as Emma worked on mending a shirt that had been sitting in his sewing basket for months, Thomas found himself stealing glances at her hands. They moved with practiced precision, creating neat, nearly invisible stitches that would hold better than his own rough attempts. "You're staring again," Emma said without looking up from her work. "Sorry," Thomas said, but he didn't look away. "I'm trying to figure you out." "Nothing to figure out," Emma replied, biting off a thread. "I'm just someone who needs work." "You're more than that," Thomas said quietly. Emma's hands stilled on the fabric, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might respond. But then she resumed her sewing, the moment passing like a cloud across the sun. That evening, as they shared another meal, Thomas tried a different approach. Instead of asking about her past, he began sharing stories of his own, tales of how he'd come to live in these mountains, the challenges of building a life in such isolation. "I was a teacher," he said, watching Emma's reaction, "back in Denver. Had a good position, steady income, all the things that are supposed to matter." Emma looked up from her plate, clearly surprised. "What made you leave?" Thomas smiled ruefully. "Sometimes the things that are supposed to matter don't feel like they matter at all. I wanted something real, something I could build with my own hands." "And you found it here?" "I found peace here," Thomas said. "Not sure if that's the same thing." Emma nodded slowly, and Thomas sensed that she understood the distinction better than most. "Peace is valuable," she said quietly, "maybe more valuable than most people realize." As the days passed, a routine developed between them. Emma threw herself into the work with an intensity that spoke of deep-seated need to prove her worth. She was up before dawn and worked until well after sunset, tackling every task with meticulous care. Thomas found himself watching her more than he probably should, fascinated by the contradiction she presented. Her hands told stories of desperation and hardship, but her movements spoke of innate grace and intelligence. She cooked with the skill of someone trained in fine kitchens, but she also knew how to make a feast from scraps. She mended clothes with the precision of a professional seamstress, but she could also repair tools and tend animals with equal competence. A week into Emma's stay, the first real test of their arrangement came in the form of visitors. Thomas was splitting wood when he heard the sound of horses approaching, multiple riders moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Emma, who had been hanging laundry, immediately stiffened at the sound. Thomas watched as she seemed to calculate distances, escape routes, the way a wild animal might when sensing predators. "Emma," he said quietly, setting down his axe, "go inside. Stay there until I tell you it's safe." She looked at him with something approaching gratitude, then quickly gathered the remaining wet clothes and disappeared into the cabin. Thomas noticed that she left the back door slightly ajar, ready for a quick exit if necessary. 3 men rode into the yard, their horses lathered and breathing hard. Thomas recognized the type immediately: bounty hunters or lawmen, the kind of men who made their living tracking other people. The leader, a thin man with cold eyes and a badge pinned to his vest, dismounted and approached. "Afternoon," the man said, his hand resting casually on his gun. "I'm Marshal Kevin Morales. We're tracking a woman, goes by Emma Evans. You seen anyone matching that description?" Thomas felt his blood cool, but he kept his expression neutral. "What's she wanted for?" "Theft," Morales said, watching Thomas's face carefully. "Stole a considerable sum from her employer back east. We have reason to believe she might have passed through this area." "I haven't seen anyone like that," Thomas said, the lie coming easier than he'd expected. "What does she look like?" Morales described Emma with uncomfortable accuracy, down to the scars on her hands. Thomas listened without reaction, his mind racing. Whatever Emma had done, whatever had driven her to his door, he found himself unwilling to turn her over to these men. "You sure you haven't seen her?" one of the other men asked, his tone suggesting disbelief. "Pretty woman like that would be hard to forget, even in her current state." "I said I haven't seen her," Thomas replied, his voice taking on an edge that made the men exchange glances. Morales studied Thomas for a long moment, clearly debating whether to press the issue. Finally, he remounted his horse. "If you do see her, there's a reward. $500 for information leading to her capture." After the men left, Thomas waited a full hour before calling Emma out of hiding. She emerged from the cabin like a ghost, her face pale and her hands shaking. "They're gone," Thomas said simply. Emma nodded, but didn't speak. Thomas could see her struggling with something, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air between them. "Emma," he said gently, "I need to know what you did." She looked at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You lied for me," she said. "Why?" "Because I don't believe you're a thief," Thomas said. "At least not the kind they're making you out to be." Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been watching your hands," Thomas said. "They're honest hands. They've done hard work, real work. Not the hands of someone who takes what doesn't belong to them." Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas saw the exact moment when her carefully constructed defenses began to crumble. She sank down onto the porch steps, her hands covering her face. "I did take the money," she said, her voice muffled, "but not the way they're saying." Thomas sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd her. "Tell me." The story came out in fragments, pieces of a life that had been systematically destroyed by circumstances and cruel people. Emma had been a governess in a wealthy household back east, responsible for the care and education of 2 young children. She'd loved the job, had found purpose in nurturing young minds and helping them grow. But the master of the house had been a different sort of man entirely. He'd seen Emma's vulnerability, her lack of family or connections, and had decided she was fair game for his appetites. When she'd refused his advances, he'd made her life increasingly difficult, finding fault with her work, cutting her wages, making her existence a daily struggle. "I endured it for the children," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They needed someone who cared about them, someone who would protect them from their father's rages. But protection had come at a cost. When the master's behavior had escalated to outright assault, Emma had fought back, striking him with a fireplace poker to escape his grasp. In his rage, he'd threatened not just to dismiss her, but to have her arrested for assault, to destroy any chance she might have of finding other work. "He said he owned me," Emma continued, her hands clenching into fists. "Said that as long as he paid my wages, he could do whatever he wanted with me." That night, desperate and terrified, Emma had taken money from the household safe. Not the fortune the marshal had described, but enough to buy passage west, to escape before the master could make good on his threats. I told myself I was only taking what he owed me, Emma said. Wages he'd cut, promises he'd broken. But I knew it was stealing, no matter how I justified it. Thomas listened without judgment, recognizing the impossible position she'd been placed in. What happened to the children? Emma's composure finally broke completely. I don't know, she sobbed. I had to leave them with him. I had no choice, but I left them with him. Thomas found himself reaching out, his hand covering hers. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but she didn't pull away. You survived, he said quietly. Sometimes that's all we can do. But at what cost? Emma asked. I became exactly what he said I was, a thief, a criminal. You became someone who refused to be a victim, Thomas corrected. There's a difference. That night, Emma's nightmares were worse than usual. Thomas woke to the sound of her crying out in her sleep, words that spoke of guilt and fear and desperate regret. He lay in his own bed, listening to her pain and feeling helpless to ease it. In the morning, she was back to her usual efficiency, as if the previous day's revelations had never happened. But Thomas noticed the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit. The routine they'd established began to shift as autumn deepened into the promise of winter. Thomas found himself looking forward to their shared meals, to the quiet conversations that had begun to replace the careful silence of those first days. Emma was proving to be not just a capable worker, but intelligent company, someone who could discuss books and ideas with an insight that spoke of real education. You were more than a governess, Thomas observed one evening as they discussed a volume of poetry he'd lent her. Emma looked up from the book, her finger marking her place. What makes you say that? The way you analyze the text, the connections you make. You've had formal education. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas thought she might retreat behind her walls again. But instead, she set the book aside and met his gaze directly. I attended a women's college back east, she said. My father believed in education for women, said it was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from us. Her laugh was bitter. He was wrong about that, too. What happened? He died, Emma said simply. Suddenly, without warning, left debts I never knew existed. The college fees stopped being paid, and I was asked to leave. The governess position was all I could find. Thomas began to understand the depth of the fall she'd experienced, from educated young woman to desperate fugitive. Your family couldn't help? What family? Emma asked. My mother died when I was young. My father was all I had, and when he was gone, I discovered that everything I thought was secure was built on borrowed money and broken promises. The conversation stayed with Thomas as he went about his work the next day. He found himself watching Emma with new understanding, seeing not just the desperation that had brought her to his door, but the strength it must have taken to survive the complete destruction of the life she'd known. That afternoon, as Emma worked in his garden harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first hard frost, Thomas made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Emma, he called out, approaching where she knelt among the potato plants. I've been thinking. She looked up, dirt on her hands and a smudge across her cheek, looking more beautiful than any woman had a right to look while doing farm work. About what? About winter, Thomas said. It comes hard and fast up here. The passes will be snowed in by November, and they won't clear until spring. Emma nodded, her expression carefully neutral. You want me to leave before then? No, Thomas said, the word coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. I want you to stay. Emma sat back on her heels, staring at him. Stay? Through the winter, Thomas clarified. It's not safe for you to travel now. Not with those men looking for you. And I could use the help. It was a practical offer, framed in practical terms. But Thomas knew there was more to it than that. Somewhere in the past weeks, Emma had become more than just a temporary employee. She'd become part of the rhythm of his days, part of the peace he'd found in these mountains. Thomas, Emma said quietly, you don't understand what you're offering. If they come back, if they find me here, you could be charged as an accessory. You could lose everything. I understand the risks, Thomas replied. I'm willing to take them. Emma studied his face, looking for something he wasn't sure he was ready to reveal. Why? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to voice. Thomas found himself looking at her hands again, those scarred, capable hands that had come to represent so much more than he'd initially understood. "Because you belong here," he said finally, the words surprising him with their truth. Emma's breath caught, and for a moment Thomas thought she might cry again, but instead she nodded slowly, acceptance and something deeper passing between them. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." The decision changed something fundamental in their relationship. With the promise of months ahead of them, they began to settle into something deeper than the careful politeness of employer and employee. Emma began to make small changes to the cabin, adding touches that made it feel more like a home and less like a temporary shelter. Thomas found himself sharing more stories, more of himself than he had with anyone in years. One evening, as the first snow began to fall outside, Emma looked up from her mending to find Thomas watching her again. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Your hands," Thomas said honestly. Emma looked down at her hands, holding the needle suspended in the lamplight. "They're not much to look at." "They're everything to look at," Thomas said quietly. "They tell the story of who you are, what you've survived, what you're capable of. They're the most honest thing about you." Emma set down her sewing, flexing her fingers as if seeing them through his eyes. "Most people find them disturbing." "Most people don't know how to see strength," Thomas replied. "Those scars, that damage, they're not marks of weakness. They're proof that you've lived, that you've fought, that you've refused to give up no matter what life threw at you." Emma looked at him with wonder, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language she was just beginning to understand. "How can you see them that way?" "Because I see you," Thomas said simply. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Emma slept without nightmares. Winter settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, sealing them off from the outside world in a cocoon of snow and silence. The isolation that might have driven some people to distraction became a blessing for Thomas and Emma, a chance to exist without the constant fear of discovery or judgment. Emma threw herself into preparing for the long months ahead with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She preserved vegetables, salted meat, organized supplies with the efficiency of someone who understood that careful preparation could mean the difference between comfort and survival. Thomas watched her work with growing admiration. She approached each task not just with competence, but with an intuitive understanding of how everything connected. The way she arranged the root cellar ensured that they would have fresh vegetables well into spring. Her method of preserving meat would keep them supplied with protein, even if hunting became impossible. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked one day, as she demonstrated a technique for smoking fish that was new to him. "Necessity," Emma replied, adjusting the fire to maintain the proper temperature. "When you've been hungry, really hungry, you learn to make the most of everything." But it was more than just survival skills, Thomas realized. Emma had an intuitive understanding of domestic arts that spoke of natural talent as well as hard experience. She could transform the simplest ingredients into meals that were not just nourishing, but genuinely delicious. Her sewing was precise enough to be professional, and she had a gift for organization that made their small space feel larger and more comfortable. As the days grew shorter and the snow deeper, they developed new routines that drew them closer together. Evening meals became longer affairs, followed by reading aloud by the fire or quiet conversations that ranged from practical matters to philosophy and literature. Thomas discovered that Emma had opinions on everything from politics to poetry, insights shaped by her education, but tempered by her experiences on the margins of society. She saw things from angles he'd never considered, understood struggles he'd only read about in books. "You think differently than most people," he observed one evening as they discussed a newspaper article he'd been saving from his last trip to town. "You mean I think like someone who's been on the bottom," Emma said with characteristic directness. "It changes your perspective when you've seen how quickly everything you think is secure can disappear. Is that necessarily a bad thing?" Emma considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "It makes you appreciate what you have, makes you less likely to take things for granted." Thomas nodded, understanding that her experiences had given her a wisdom that couldn't be learned from books or comfortable circumstances. She valued things differently because she understood their true cost. As winter deepened, they began to work together on projects that required both their skills. Thomas had always been handy with wood and tools, but Emma's eye for detail and proportion elevated their efforts. Together, they built furniture that was both functional and beautiful, created storage solutions that maximized their limited space, made improvements to the cabin that would serve them well beyond winter. Working side by side, Thomas became even more aware of Emma's hands. He watched them guide a plane across wood, creating shavings so thin they were nearly transparent. He saw them measure and mark with precision that would have impressed a master craftsman. Those scarred, damaged hands created beauty with an ease that spoke of natural talent refined by necessity. "You're an artist," he said one day as she put the finishing touches on a cabinet they'd built together. Emma paused, her hands stilling on the wood. "I'm a survivor. You can be both?" She looked at him then, and Thomas saw something shift in her expression. "I used to think I might be," she said quietly, before everything fell apart. "What stopped you?" "Life," Emma said simply. "Hard choices, the need to eat and have shelter. Art is a luxury I couldn't afford." "Maybe it's not a luxury," Thomas suggested. "Maybe it's part of what makes survival worthwhile." That conversation stayed with Emma through the following days. Thomas noticed her paying more attention to the aesthetic aspects of their work, taking time to create beauty even in purely functional items. She began to add small decorative touches to their daily life, arranging flowers in winter, creating patterns in the way she folded clothes, finding ways to make their simple existence more beautiful. One evening, as they sat by the fire working on separate projects, Thomas looked up to find Emma sketching in the margins of an old newspaper. Her hand moved with quick, confident strokes, capturing the play of firelight on the cabin walls with remarkable skill. "You draw," he said, trying to keep the surprise out of his voice. Emma looked up, almost guilty, as if she'd been caught at something shameful. "Just idle sketching." "May I see?" She hesitated, then handed over the paper. Thomas studied the drawing, impressed by the technical skill, but more moved by what she'd chosen to capture. It wasn't just the physical details of their evening scene, but something more ephemeral, a sense of peace and contentment that transformed their simple cabin into something approaching sacred space. "This is beautiful," he said, meaning it completely. "It's just something to do with my hands," Emma said, but Thomas could see that his approval meant something to her. "Do you have other drawings?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. "A few," she admitted, "hidden in my things. Would you show them to me?" The request clearly made her uncomfortable, but after a moment's hesitation, she went to her room and returned with a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were perhaps a dozen sketches, drawn on whatever papers she'd been able to find during her travels. Thomas studied them in silence, moved by what they revealed about Emma's journey. Here was a drawing of children playing in a city street, their joy captured despite the obvious poverty of their surroundings. There was a portrait of an old woman, her face lined with hardship, but her eyes bright with determination. Another showed a landscape from her travels west, the vastness of the prairie rendered with an eye for both beauty and loneliness. "These are extraordinary," Thomas said finally. "You have real talent." "Talent doesn't put food on the table," Emma replied, but there was less conviction in her voice than there might have been weeks earlier. "Maybe not directly," Thomas said, "but it puts beauty in the world. That has to count for something." As winter reached its deepest point, Thomas and Emma settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The outside world seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the two of them in the comfortable routines they'd created together. Emma had begun to sketch more regularly, often drawing Thomas as he worked or read by the fire. She claimed it was just practice, but Thomas noticed that she captured not just his physical appearance, but something deeper, moments of contentment or concentration that revealed aspects of his character he wasn't sure he knew himself. "You see things differently than other people," he observed one evening as she showed him a drawing she'd made of him repairing a harness. "How so?" "You see what matters," Thomas said, studying the sketch. "Not just what something looks like, but what it means." Emma considered this. Maybe that comes from having to pay attention to details. When your survival depends on reading people correctly, you learn to see past the surface. Thomas understood. Emma's experiences had taught her to observe carefully, to notice the small signs that revealed character and intention. It was a skill that served her well as an artist, but it had been born from necessity rather than choice. One particularly cold night, when the wind howled around the cabin and the fire seemed to provide the only warmth in the world, Emma made a confession that surprised them both. "I'm happy here," she said, looking up from her sewing. "I know I shouldn't be, given the circumstances, but I am." Thomas set down his book, giving her his full attention. "Why shouldn't you be?" "Because I'm a fugitive," Emma said. "Because I'm living under false pretenses, putting you at risk. Because this isn't real life, just a temporary shelter from reality." "It feels real to me," Thomas said quietly. Emma met his gaze, and Thomas saw a vulnerability there that she rarely allowed herself to show. "What happens when spring comes? When the pass is clear and those men can reach us again?" It was a question they'd both been avoiding, the shadow that hung over their peaceful winter existence. Thomas had been thinking about it more and more as the days began to lengthen, as signs of approaching spring became visible despite the continuing snow. "We'll figure it out," he said, though he had no clear plan. "Thomas," Emma said, her voice serious, "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me. If they come back, I'll go with them. I won't let you be charged as an accessory." "That's not your decision to make," Thomas replied, his own voice taking on an edge. "It's my life, my choices that brought this situation about. I won't let you pay for my mistakes." Thomas stood up, pacing to the window, where he could see the snow still falling steadily. "You talk about your mistakes as if you had better choices available, as if you could have handled an impossible situation perfectly. I could have found another way." "What other way?" Thomas turned back to face her. "Let him assault you? Except that your body was part of your wages?" "There was no other way, Emma. You did what you had to do to survive with your dignity intact." Emma stared at him, and Thomas saw that his words had shaken something loose in her carefully constructed understanding of her own actions. "You really believe that?" she said wonderingly. "I believe you're one of the strongest people I've ever met," Thomas said. "I believe you've been dealt a series of impossible hands and played them as well as anyone could. I believe you deserve better than to spend the rest of your life running from a choice you made to protect yourself." Emma was quiet for a long time, absorbing his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "No one has ever seen it that way before." "Then no one has been looking hard enough," Thomas said. That night something shifted between them. The careful boundaries they'd maintained, the polite distance of employer and employee, began to dissolve into something deeper and more honest. Emma began to share more of her story, not just the dramatic moments that had driven her west, but the smaller details that revealed who she'd been before circumstances had stripped away so much of her life. She told him about her childhood, about a father who had encouraged her education and artistic interests, about dreams she'd harbored of using her talents in ways that might make a difference in the world. Thomas, in turn, shared his own story more completely. He told her about his years as a teacher, about the frustration of trying to educate young minds in a system that seemed designed to crush curiosity and independent thought. He explained his decision to leave civilization behind, his search for something more authentic than the life he'd been living. "I thought I'd found it here," he said one evening, as they sat by the fire. "The peace, the simplicity, the connection to something real. But I was still alone." "And now?" Emma asked. Thomas looked at her, taking in the way the firelight played across her face, the way her hands moved as she worked on her latest sketch. "Now I understand the difference between solitude and loneliness." Emma's hands stilled on her drawing, and she looked up to meet his gaze. "Thomas." "I know," he said quickly. "I know the complications, the impossibility of the situation. But I needed you to know." Emma set aside her sketch and moved closer to him on the small sofa they shared during their evening conversations. "I need you to know something too," she said. "These months with you, this winter, it's been the first time since my father died that I've felt safe. Really safe. Not just physically, but emotionally. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." What's that? The belief that I might deserve kindness, Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas reached out, covering her hands with his own. Those scarred, capable hands that had first caught his attention, that had told him so much about who she was before he'd ever heard her story. You deserve more than kindness, he said. You deserve love. Emma's breath caught, and for a moment Thomas thought she might pull away. But instead, she turned her hands palm up beneath his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt like a promise. I love you too, she whispered. They sat together in the firelight, hands joined, both understanding that they'd crossed a line from which there would be no easy retreat. The future remained uncertain, full of dangers and complications they couldn't yet resolve. But in that moment, surrounded by the peace they'd created together, it was enough to simply acknowledge what had grown between them. Spring came slowly to the mountains, arriving first in subtle signs that only those who lived close to the land would notice. The quality of light began to change. The snow started to settle and compact, and the wind carried hints of warming that promised eventual freedom from winter's grip. For Thomas and Emma, each sign of approaching spring carried mixed emotions. The beauty of the changing season was undeniable, but with it came the return of the outside world and all the complications they'd been able to forget during their months of isolation. Emma threw herself into spring preparations with characteristic intensity, but Thomas noticed an underlying tension in her movements, a hypervigilance that spoke of someone preparing for flight. She began to organize her few possessions, keeping them ready for quick packing. Her sketches, which had multiplied over the winter months, were carefully wrapped and stored where they could be easily carried. You're planning to leave, Thomas observed one morning as he watched her methodically checking and rechecking her supplies. Emma paused in her work, her hands stilling on the bundles she'd been organizing. I'm planning to be ready, she corrected. If I need to leave quickly, I don't want to put you in more danger than necessary. Thomas felt frustration rise in his chest. They'd grown so close over the winter months, had acknowledged their love for each other, but Emma still couldn't seem to believe that he might be willing to face danger for her sake. What if I don't want you to leave? He asked. Thomas, Emma said, turning to face him fully, be realistic. Those men will come back as soon as the pass is clear. When they do, I need to be gone, or you need to be able to honestly say you haven't seen me. I won't lie for you again, Thomas said, surprising himself with the firmness of his declaration. Emma stared at him. What do you mean? I mean, if they come back, I'm not going to pretend I don't know you. I'm not going to let you disappear into the wilderness to face whatever's out there alone. You don't understand what you're saying, Emma protested. If you're caught harboring a fugitive, you could go to prison. You could lose everything you've built here. And if I let you go, I lose everything that matters, Thomas replied. They stared at each other across the cabin, the weight of impossible choices hanging heavy between them. Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and Thomas could see her struggling with emotions she'd kept carefully controlled throughout their months together. I won't be responsible for destroying your life, she said finally. You're not destroying anything, Thomas said, moving closer to her. You're the best thing that's happened to my life. Emma shook her head, tears beginning to flow despite her obvious efforts to control them. You don't understand. I'm poison, Thomas. Everyone who tries to help me gets hurt. The children I left behind, the people who might have given me references if I'd asked, I destroy everything I touch. Thomas reached out, gently taking her hands in his, those hands that had become so precious to him, that told the story of her strength and survival. Look at these hands, he said softly. Really look at them. What do you see? Scars, Emma whispered. Damage. Proof of everything I've done wrong. I see hands that have worked to build something beautiful here, Thomas said. Hands that have cooked meals that nourished us both, that have sewn clothes that kept us warm, that have created art that brought beauty into our lives. I see hands that have touched me with more tenderness than I've ever known. Emma looked down at their joined hands, and Thomas could see her trying to reconcile his vision with her own harsh self-judgment. These hands have also stolen, she said quietly. These hands have also survived, Thomas countered. They've protected you when no one else would. They've created something good out of impossible circumstances. Emma was quiet for a long time, studying their intertwined fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I'm scared, Thomas. I'm scared of what will happen to you because of me." "I'm scared too," Thomas admitted, "but I'm more scared of living without you." That afternoon, as they worked together in the garden preparing the soil for spring planting, Thomas made a decision that had been building in his mind for weeks. "Emma," he said, pausing in his digging, "marry me." Emma dropped her hoe, staring at him in shock. "What?" "Marry me," Thomas repeated, setting down his own tools and moving to face her. "Before the pass is clear, before anyone can come looking for you. Marry me." "Thomas, that's insane," Emma said. But Thomas could see something flickering in her eyes that might have been hope. "Is it?" Thomas asked. "If you're my wife, it changes everything. I'm not harboring a fugitive. I'm protecting my family. The law looks different at a man defending his wife than it does at someone helping a stranger." Emma shook her head, but Thomas could see her considering the possibilities. "It wouldn't be legal. I'm using a false name, living under false pretenses." "Emma Evans is your real name," Thomas pointed out. "You told me so yourself. The false pretenses are just circumstances, not identity. But the charges against me would still exist," Thomas acknowledged. "But as my wife, you'd have protections you don't have as a single woman. Legal standing, the right to have your story heard by a jury of peers." Emma stared at him, and Thomas could see her mind working through the implications. "You're talking about fighting the charges instead of running from them. I'm talking about building a life instead of just surviving," Thomas said. "Together." Emma was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving from Thomas to the garden they'd been preparing, to the cabin that had become their home, to the mountains that surrounded their small piece of peace. "What if we lose?" she asked finally. "What if we win?" Thomas countered. That evening, Emma made her decision. She found Thomas reading by the fire and sat down beside him, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "Yes," she said simply. Thomas looked up from his book. "Yes?" "Yes. I'll marry you," Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If you're sure, if you understand the risks, then yes." Thomas set aside his book and took her hands in his, those precious, scarred hands that had first told him who she really was. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. They were married 3 days later by a traveling preacher who'd been making his rounds through the mountain communities before the spring thaw made travel easier. Thomas had ridden down to the nearest settlement to find him, explaining only that he and his intended bride wanted to be wed before the busy season began. Emma wore the best dress she owned, carefully mended and pressed for the occasion. It was simple, practical clothing rather than wedding finery, but Thomas thought she'd never looked more beautiful. Her hands shook slightly as they exchanged vows, but her voice was clear and strong. "Do you, Emma Evans, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Emma said, looking directly into Thomas's eyes. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Emma gently, sealing a promise that went far beyond the simple ceremony. They were binding their fates together, choosing to face whatever came as partners rather than individuals. That night, as they lay together in the cabin that was now truly their shared home, Emma traced patterns on Thomas's chest with her fingertips. "Are you sorry?" she asked quietly. "Now that it's done, do you regret it?" Thomas captured her hand, bringing it to his lips to kiss her palm. "The only thing I regret is that we waited so long," he said. Emma smiled, the first truly carefree expression he'd seen from her since the day she'd arrived at his door. "I love you, Thomas Williams." "I love you too, Emma Williams," he replied, and they both savored the sound of her new name. The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness that felt almost surreal after the months of uncertainty. Emma began to settle into her role as Thomas's wife with a contentment that transformed her entire demeanor. The constant tension that had marked her movements began to ease, replaced by a confidence that spoke of someone who finally felt she belonged somewhere. She threw herself into spring projects with renewed energy, planning improvements to their home and property that spoke of someone thinking in terms of years rather than days. Her sketches began to include architectural details, ideas for additions to the cabin, designs for furniture and decorative elements that would make their space more beautiful and functional. Thomas watched this transformation with wonder and growing love. This was the woman Emma had been before circumstances had forced her into survival mode. Someone with dreams and plans and the skills to make them reality. But their peace was not destined to last. On a warm morning in late April, as Emma worked in her expanded garden and Thomas repaired winter damage to the cabin's roof, the sound of approaching horses shattered their tranquil existence. Thomas looked up from his work to see three riders approaching at a steady pace. Even from a distance, he recognized the lead figure. Marshal Morales returned with the spring thaw to continue his hunt. "Emma," Thomas called quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. She looked up from her planting, saw the riders, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might run. Her body tensed, her eyes calculating distances and escape routes with the instinctive response of someone who'd spent months as prey. But then she straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and walked calmly to stand beside her husband. "No more running," she said quietly, as much to herself as to Thomas. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, and Marshal Morales dismounted with the confident air of someone who'd finally cornered his quarry. "Well, well," he said, his cold eyes moving from Thomas to Emma. "Looks like our mountain man found himself some company after all." "Marshal," Thomas said evenly, moving to stand slightly in front of Emma, "what brings you back to my property?" "I think you know," Morales replied. "The woman standing behind you matches the description of Emma Evans, wanted for theft in the state of Pennsylvania. I'm here to take her into custody." "The woman standing behind me is Emma Williams," Thomas said calmly. "My wife." Morales's eyes narrowed. "When did this alleged marriage take place?" "3 weeks ago," Thomas replied. "Performed by Pastor Robert Alvarez, recorded in the county registry." Emma stepped forward, no longer hiding behind Thomas's protection. "I'm Emma Williams," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "And yes, I'm the woman you're looking for." One of the other men moved his hand toward his weapon, but Morales held up a restraining gesture. "At least you're not going to waste our time with denials." "No," Emma said, "I'm not going to waste anyone's time. But I'm also not going to let you take me without hearing the whole story." "The story is simple," Morales said. "You stole money from your employer and fled west to avoid prosecution." "The story," Emma said, her voice taking on strength with each word, "is that I defended myself against a man who thought he owned me, body and soul. And I took compensation for wages he'd stolen and dignity he'd tried to destroy." Thomas felt pride swell in his chest as he watched his wife face down her accusers. This was the Emma he'd glimpsed in moments of strength throughout their months together. The woman who'd survived everything life had thrown at her and emerged with her integrity intact. "That's not how the law sees it," Morales said. But Thomas noticed that the marshal's certainty seemed slightly shaken by Emma's directness. "Then maybe the law needs to hear from witnesses who can speak to my character," Thomas said. "As her husband, I have the right to demand a fair trial, not a summary judgment based on one man's accusations." Morales studied them both, clearly calculating the complications that Emma's marriage had introduced to what should have been a simple arrest. "You understand," he said finally, "that marriage doesn't erase the charges against her. She'll still have to stand trial." "We understand," Thomas said, "but she'll stand trial as a married woman with legal representation, not as a friendless fugitive." "And I'll stand trial telling the truth," Emma added. "All of it. Let a jury decide whether a woman has the right to defend herself against assault." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, the three lawmen facing the determined couple. Finally, Morales made his decision. "I'm placing you under arrest, Mrs. Williams," he said formally. "You'll be transported back east to stand trial on charges of theft." "I understand," Emma said, "but I'm not going anywhere without my husband." Thomas felt his heart swell with love and admiration for this woman who'd found the courage to stop running and start fighting. "We'll travel together," he said firmly, "as is my right as her husband." The journey east was long and difficult, but Thomas and Emma faced it together with a determination that seemed to strengthen with each passing mile. Emma no longer rode with the hunched shoulders of a fugitive, but with the upright posture of someone who decided to meet her fate head-on. During the long days on the trail, she told Thomas more of her story, filling in details she'd been too ashamed or frightened to share before. She spoke of the master's escalating demands, the way he'd used her isolation and vulnerability against her, the impossible choice between submission and resistance that had ultimately led to her flight. "I keep thinking about those children," she said one evening as they made camp. "I wonder if they're all right, if someone else is protecting them now." "You protected them as long as you could," Thomas replied. "That's all anyone could ask." "Was it enough?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "You can't save everyone, Emma. Sometimes the best you can do is save yourself and hope that your survival means something." "What does my survival mean?" Thomas looked at his wife, taking in the strength that had carried her through so much hardship, the hands that had created beauty even in the darkest circumstances, the spirit that had refused to be broken despite everything she'd endured. "It means that courage exists," he said. "It means that people can face impossible choices and still maintain their integrity. It means that love can grow even in the hardest ground." When they finally reached Philadelphia, Thomas hired the best lawyer his savings could afford, a man named Lionel Adams who specialized in cases involving women's rights and domestic violence. Adams listened to Emma's story with the careful attention of someone who'd heard similar tales before. "The challenge," he explained, "will be convincing a jury that a woman has the right to defend herself against her employer's sexual advances. The law is not traditionally sympathetic to servants who resist their master's demands." "Then we change the law," Emma said with quiet determination. "Or at least plant the seeds for change," Adams agreed. "Your case could set an important precedent." The trial, when it finally began, drew more attention than anyone had anticipated. Word had spread about the mountain woman who'd chosen to fight rather than flee, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, curious to see how the drama would unfold. Emma took the witness stand with the same calm dignity she'd shown throughout their ordeal. She told her story simply and directly, holding nothing back, her scarred hands folded carefully in her lap as she spoke. "I knew taking the money was theft," she said in response to the prosecutor's aggressive questioning. "But I also knew that staying would mean submitting to continued assault or facing trumped-up charges that would destroy any chance I had of finding other employment. I took what I felt was owed to me for wages stolen and dignity destroyed." The prosecutor pressed hard, trying to paint her as a scheming woman who'd used false accusations to cover her crimes. But Emma's honesty, her willingness to admit her actions while explaining their necessity, seemed to resonate with the jury. Thomas testified as well, speaking to Emma's character, her work ethic, her fundamental honesty in all their dealings. Other witnesses came forward. The preacher who'd married them, neighbors from their mountain community, who'd observed Emma's contributions to their small society. But the most powerful moment came when Emma's former employer took the stand. Under Adams's skilled questioning, the man's true character began to emerge. His arrogance, his sense of entitlement, his casual dismissal of his servants' rights painted a picture that supported Emma's version of events. "Did you consider Mrs. Williams's person to be part of her employment obligations?" Adams asked. "I considered her to be in my employ," the man replied stiffly. "That wasn't the question. Did you believe that her body, her physical person, was included in what you purchased with her wages?" The man's hesitation spoke volumes. "I believed she should be grateful for my attention." "Grateful for unwanted sexual advances?" "I never forced myself on anyone." "But you tried to, didn't you? And when she resisted, you threatened her employment, her references, her ability to find other work?" The man's silence was answer enough. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: not guilty on all charges. Emma collapsed into Thomas's arms as the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. She'd not only cleared her name, but struck a blow for women everywhere who faced similar circumstances. Outside the courthouse, as reporters shouted questions and well-wishers offered congratulations, Emma looked down at her hands with wonder. "I can't believe it's over," she said. "It's not over," Thomas replied, taking her hands in his. "It's just beginning." They returned to their mountain home as heroes, their story having spread throughout the territory and beyond. Emma's courage in facing her accusers had inspired other women to speak out about their own experiences, and lawyers began citing her case as precedent in similar situations. But for Thomas and Emma, the real victory was simpler and more personal. They'd faced the storm together and emerged stronger, their love tested and proven in the crucible of public scrutiny and legal challenge. Emma threw herself back into their mountain life with renewed joy, her art flourishing as she no longer had to hide her talents or her identity. She began teaching other women in their community, sharing skills in everything from practical crafts to reading and writing. Thomas watched his wife bloom in ways he'd only imagined possible, her confidence and happiness transforming not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The woman who'd arrived at his door begging for work had become a pillar of their community, respected and admired for her strength and wisdom. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Emma held up her hands to study them in the fading light. "You know what I see now when I look at these hands?" she asked. "What?" "I see hands that have built something beautiful," she said. "Hands that have loved and been loved. Hands that have fought for what's right and won." Thomas took those precious hands in his own, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect peace. "I see the same thing," he said. "I see the hands of the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas and Emma sat together in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, their hearts full of gratitude for the love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. Emma's hands, once symbols of desperation and hardship, had become the foundation of a love story that would be told for generations. They were hands that had known suffering, but had never surrendered hope. Hands that had created beauty from ashes. Hands that had quite literally held their love suspended over the abyss and refused to let go. In the end, it wasn't the dramatic rescue from the canyon that had defined their relationship, though that moment of crisis had certainly tested their bond. It was the quiet daily choice to see past surface appearances to the truth beneath, to value character over circumstances, to believe that love could flourish even in the hardest ground. Thomas had seen Emma's hands on that first day and recognized in their scars and calluses the story of someone who'd never given up. Emma had learned to see her own hands through his eyes as symbols of strength rather than shame, as tools that had built something beautiful rather than simply survived something terrible. Their love story began with hands that told tales of hardship and grew into hands that created beauty, defended truth, and held fast to hope even in the darkest moments. It was a love built on the foundation of seeing clearly, of valuing what truly mattered, of understanding that the most beautiful things in life often came disguised as the most broken. As they rose to go inside for the evening, Emma paused to look back at the mountains that had sheltered their love through its most vulnerable stages. "Thank you," she whispered to the peaks and valleys that had given them time to grow, space to heal, and the peace to discover what they meant to each other. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "For what?" "For giving me a place to belong," Emma said. "For teaching me that home isn't a place, it's a person who sees you clearly and loves you anyway." Hand in hand, they walked into their cabin, into their life together, into a future bright with possibility. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of years to be shared, of a love that had been tested in fire and emerged pure gold. Emma's hands, those honest, scarred, beautiful hands, had led her home at last.